Hello, I'm Sue Ader, a member of the GCAAR Forms Committee. We have been busy changing and reworking the forms to help the consumer better understand the transaction and the listing process. All in all, 10 forms have been changed, and today I'm going to give you a brief description of the changes made to 4 forms. The first form is Form 1341, the Buyer Agency Agreement. To be clear and transparent about how a buyer-broker gets paid, the form has undergone some changes. The buyer-broker agreement sets up both brokerage and contractual relationships. Now more than ever, it's very important when you are working with buyers, as a buyer's agent, you have this form negotiated and signed before you even begin to show properties, so that you have determined with your buyer what you will be paid at settlement for your services. As before, the basic premise remains the same. The compensation field has been expanded. The buyer and buyer's agent will set a compensation amount due at settlement. The buyer can now choose to be obligated for the payment of compensation at closing or choose to request the seller's payment and/or contribution. Regardless of the choice, the buyer remains obligated for compensation due if the seller elects not to compensate the buyer-broker. This agreement states that any seller offered compensation to buyer's agent will be specified in an additional addendum to the purchase contract, and the buyer may also elect to pay any additional compensation to the buyer's agent. Now we'll talk about Form 301. This is the seller-paid buyer-broker compensation notice. This is a new form. The protocol for agreement of compensation will rely on the completion and receipt of this form prior to showing a property. This notice will be used as confirmation and documentation of seller's offer of compensation to the buyer-broker. Ideally, the buyer's agent will have received this notice before showing a property to their client and be able to communicate with the buyer any buyer responsibility towards compensation per the buyer-broker agreement, if not covered by the seller in an offer of compensation. Now we're going to talk about Form 910 and 920. This is the listing agreements for improved and unimproved real property. There are several changes to these forms. The changes in the 2 listing agreements are as follows. Number 1, there is an inclusion of properties per Bright's new policy regarding properties not ready for public marketing. Number 2, the requirement to include the Bright MLS form disclosures and residential seller/landlord options. Number 3, there is a definition of public and non-public marketing. Number 4, you now have the choice of 4 listing statuses. The first one is pre-marketing status, the second, coming soon, the third, active, and the fourth is the limited office exclusive. The compensation is now broken down into choices addressing what the seller is willing to offer. There is compensation to the listing broker. There is additional compensation to the listing broker for an unrepresented buyer, and there's the buyer-broker compensation and subagent compensation. The numbering in these forms have changed to accommodate the new fields. Thank you for viewing this brief description of the changes to our forms.